talk about New Canaan real estate in honor of Skip Sisson's 90th birthday, 93rd, how many? 90. And now we have Laszlo, Papp, the former chairman of Planning and Zoning, to talk about real estate. We have Chris Hussey, who's been a realtor since 1972. And we have Susan Engel, who's been a realtor since 1983. And Skip, I think, since 1960s, yes? So since the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then me, I guess, in only 20 years ago. So, in preparation, I thought I would stimulate the conversation with a few slides that will remind us of what it has been like for the last 70 years. But then I'd like to really turn the camera on our guests and hear some of their stories and some of their impressions of what it was like back then. So, I'm going to begin with this shot of Elm Street and Park Street, and that is the original Brotherhood, Stevens, and Higley one-story building from 1929. And I believe that it might have gotten a second story in 1936. Chris Hussey, you don't remember that, do you? Okay.
I wasn't even born.
She wasn't born yet. Go ahead, man.
Was there a gas station across the street?
There was. There was a gas station where Starbucks is now.
Two gas stations.
And a gas station where Citibank is what keeps reminding us.
And a Gristedes nearby.
And a Gristedes where?
Gristedes is next to the gas station on Elm Street.
Okay, opposite Brotherhood and Higley was Gristedes.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next slide brought us to 1935. I found this at the Historical Society because this was the front page of a brochure, and this is the back page for the map. But this is a brochure offering 8 lots, 8 houses, okay? And then they show the map on the back, and you see that it basically, this is West Road, and it's basically like the entire upper half of West Road was eight houses. And here they offered, 8 buildable lots in 1935 and 1936. And so we're going to want to ask Laszlo in a minute how you control, when somebody wants to subdivide into 8 lots, do you let them do it? So we're going to get into that in a minute.
John, what was the cost of the 8?
I don't remember the lot costs. I don't think it tells me in the brochure.
Oh, okay. I hate that for real estate. Price information.
I got to tell you, so that's a good point. How much did you get to actually advertise? And this is in 1951. So we're beginning to create the Board of Realtors in the early 50s. And you see that you have James Real Estate. You don't even get 2 names. You just get James Real Estate, and you get Ross, or you got Shepherd. You don't even get 2 names back in the 50s. And in this case, you don't get a name at all. It's just, you just call that number somebody on Silver Mine Road, Good Neighbor Real Estate.
Were those town restrictions on advertising?
No, that's just the way things were in 1951. And what struck me is that it evolves quickly and also in the early 50s, we now start to see the Ross Agency still, and when James Real Estate, but now you have Mrs. Paul Lundy Country Homes, and Brotherhood, Stevens, and Higley Inc. Real Estate, and you've got Stuart Higley, Catlin, and Grant, and they've offered 3 houses, 23,000, 27,000, 27,000. So that's in the 1950s.
Sold.
I'll take 2. You still don't have, right? It's Maurice Roche, real estate broker. You still don't have an MLS. So in those days, it's called pocket listings because you put them in your pocket, and people would say, "What have you got?" And you'd go through and you'd be like, "Well, how about this one?" So that was the way real estate apparently was done right up until the MLS is introduced in 1956. And a bunch of the realtors, I think about 27 in those early days, got together and formed the MLS. and voted a secretary and created this early brochure on what is the MLS, what does it mean to you, what do you do, what are your obligations. Here's a 1966 ad I thought was interesting, because now we're starting to see the MLS is member multiple listing system MLS. That's the Mabel Lamb before she adopted a logo of a lamb, and Boyd Jones and Associates Realtors. So you have the Realtors seal of approval on all of these ads, and now you have a full page of ads for the first time. But it's already taken to the 1960s till we've gotten there. Of note, Carl Buick has got an ad that week. Carl Chevy, of course, not so much. But Carl Buick is getting it done. That's the other side of the family?
That was the big rock side.
That's your building.
That's, yeah, what the glass house is in now was Carl Buick. It was a livery stable, right, their offices. So it was a livery stable, that's why the arches, and for the train station across the street in 1915. And then in the 1950s, and 60s, it was a Buick dealership. And I think it moved to Stamford in the 70s. Saab and
Saab
Buick.
moved to Beatty Street and they closed that.
Right.
It became the Globe store, which was a hardware store.
I thought it was Globe Tire.
Globe, they had a little-
And hardware.
Yeah.
Globe Tires and hardware. Okay. I thought this was a fascinating letter I found in the archives, and I just called out some of the. This is a letter from the Board of Realtors to the Historical Society, basically saying, no, we're not going to give you our our listing sheets. Remember those pocket listings, because they have confidential information on them. And we know that you're trying to put an archive together, but this is confidential and not open to the general public. So we don't want people going down to the Historical Society checking out the history of properties and how many bedrooms and and the details. Because some owners may not understand the purpose of our willingness to cooperate in building up the information on New Canaan homes. So we're willing to do this, but we need you to restrict access. And that's a recurring theme back then is, we're very private. And this is sort of the evolution of this idea of private home information being made public and being part of a multiple listing service is a really radical idea. And so here we are, 1972, and that's when Chris Hussey comes to town and puts her mark on the real estate business. I could not find your ads in 1972, but by then Mabel Lamb has adopted a logo. It has a lamb, and then this guy's actually selling firewood. That's not a logo. And William Pitt. This is the first time I see William Pitt in town. Mabel Lamb, and there's Brotherhood and Higley with this sort of bridge, I don't know, stone bridge logo that they use for a bunch of years. And then this is the multiple listing, 1356, that was the number of that listing. And they're so proud that they put it on February 21st and it sold March 6th within 6% of evaluation. So that's an ad for the multiple, that we should trust the multiple listing service. And these are all the members of the MLS at that time. 1980, now you start to see full page ads with the houses displayed in the newspaper. There's Brotherhood and Higley, Fable Farm, Preferred Properties, the Gallery. I don't know, does it mean anything to you?
The gallery was Lundy Gallery.
Lundy Gallery, okay. 1984, Mabel Lamb, Chris Hussey.
That's
Big in the 80s, right? Preferred Properties, Margaret Hecker, and there's Bill Hecker's name underneath it. There she is. Happy New Year. 10 East Maple Street, Margaret Hecker, and then Happy 1985 from Chris Hussey. wishing us a blessed new year. And there's the Chris Hussey, also 1985. If only new construction will do. You call Chris Hussey.
And look at the price.
And the price, $744,000. 1993, Skip Sisson. And I just thought what was interesting about this is computer view. Now you got to think, computers were really just getting going, and he's the first one to use the computer to tell you closed 53 houses in 1993, up from 52 a year earlier, up from 50, and 1999 was a banner year, also 53. 659 had come down to 512, and then back up to 604, and then 588. So that was the average price. So you didn't see onward and upward, you know, they went up and they went down each year. Days on market, 180, 270, 280, 295. It took average 300 days to sell a house back in the early 90s. So maybe Skip can tell us a little bit about those days of putting together the computer view. And then finally, 2004, what $1 million will buy you. And in some towns, 7 figures often just gets a teardown. And I just thought that was a nice way to bookend the conversation.
Oh, the Connecticut section.
Yeah, from the Connecticut section. And remember in the New York Times, if you're thinking of living in,
Yeah.
and there would be, you know, New Canaan, and they would write it up. And there was also brochures back then for, you know, marketing New Canaan that realtors would pass around, or a map of our town. So I'm going to point the camera at you guys and ask, tell me about 1972. And
Now, I was just starting then, and I worked for another company, which was a SAF real estate for 10 or 11 years, and then I started on my own. I think, looking back that far to today, what is different is that we are now in an age of electronic communication. So you don't have the person-to-person contact, which personally I feel is a loss, because I can tell a great deal when we speak on the phone, when I hear your voice. When I read the message, I can read it any one of 3 or 4 ways. There's no inflection of tone. I think the communication between people is not gone, it's certainly less. We're selling more, the prices are higher, but I think it's a loss, frankly, to the seller when their agent can't get all of the information that might be out there, because it's all done electronically. That's how old I am.
Susan told me that her parents moved to New Canaan in the late 60s because they looked around and they said the zoning here was the best. What did you mean when you said that? And then we're going to ask
He
Laszlo.
lived in Stanford
How come?
with 8 children in a 4-bedroom house, and they said, as one or another left the nest, we got to make a change. What we want is we want 4 acres, not a quarter of an acre in Stanford. And you can go to New Canaan and get 4 acres and a 4-bedroom house, and that's my dream. So I said, "You're moving from Stanford, where I grew up?" Yeah, this is heaven. And he went to every single town with my mother on the weekends, and to find out what is the zoning and what is the whatever you ask.
But whoever came back from a town and said, I admire their zoning.
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
So he investigated this. If he's going to move from Stanford for all these reasons that he didn't like about it, he wanted to find out he wasn't moving into the same thing next door. And there was something unique about it. And I asked him what, and the only word I remember from his explanation, because it meant nothing to me, was the zoning. The zoning is so particular. They spend a lot of time and energy getting this right, and that's why I'm buying there. And I said, but I went with you week after week, and every weekend I'd go and look in Westport, I'd look in Southport, I'd look in Wilton, and we're always looking at houses. Oh, I like this one, I don't like that one. I mean, must have looked at 50 houses. And then I said, so which one did you pick out, Dad? The one in New Canaan. The one in New Canaan? It's like way up there on North Fulton Road. I mean, I was like, what? And, cause this is where I'm gonna go visiting from New York on the weekends, and, he said, the zoning in New Canaan. Didn't matter about the house, but,
So Laszlo, what does that mean, particular zoning?
I think from way down, our philosophy in zoning was be proactive and not reactive. Because if you deal with reactive ideas, then somebody would come to you and sell his view, his ideas. Then you stuck to that. You have to deal with this. But if somebody came and wanted to have a change or some new ideas, we said, let's sit down. That is a round table. Let's sit down. Let's talk about it. And then once it became crystal whether what's good and what's not good, then the zoning commission dealt with it proactively and made the rules according to the community interest and not the personal interest. And I think we dealt with realtors. I'm surprised you didn't have George Haynes' name mentioned. He was very active. Extremely happy. He sold me my one room summer cottage which I moved into, and people like this understood our commitment to be proactively town community interest, not I mean, everybody knows or can find the problem, but whether the problem is looked at on a restricted basis or a community basis, it's a big difference.
I think just as a member of planning and zoning now, you're right, we lost something when we got away from the pre-application conference.
Yeah.
We used to invite applicants to come in and talk to us, as you say, around the round table.
Yeah.
And one of your successors stopped doing that because he got nervous that if one of you came and sat around the table with us and said, what do you think of my plans? And we said, well, we like that, but we'd really like you to, make this a little smaller over here and make this change over there. Some of those people interpreted that like, well, I'm good to go. I've been approved. And they got annoyed when they stood in front of the entire commission, and it didn't go the same way. So he said, listen, this is just a pre-conference, meeting. It's not binding, and people don't seem to get that. So we'll just have them come and make their application in public, where it can be watched by, on TV, and all the neighbors can see. And so we've lost something because we're trying to be more transparent to neighbors on the deliberations. But now we either say yes or no at the hearing, and a lot of these people then have to sue us if they don't like the answer. And we've got a lawsuit going on as a result. I think could have been avoided if we had a pre-conference. So I think you're right. I think you're onto something. Then we could make that improvement again and go back to pre-application hearings as long as we set expectations.
Yeah.
Your turn.
I just wanted to mention, since you brought up his name, and I think it should be acknowledged, George Haynes was not smart or intelligent. George was absolutely brilliant. When they had, as you will remember, when they had questions at P&Z that no one could answer, they called George. George knew zoning really better than the zoning inspector. One of the many things he did in town, if you're probably not old enough to remember, but where we have the Locust Avenue parking lot right now was the biggest, most god-awful brick building. It was really a tenement, huge building that was really an eyesore. and he put a deal together with the David Mitchell, who owned Avon Products, tore it down and sold it eventually to the town. But he was a deal maker. He knew how to put it together, and he did a great deal, I believe, very positively for the town of New Canaan.
Was that his job, or was he a realtor, or
George
was
was
he
a
the...
realtor. He was very involved legislatively in Hartford with regard to laws that affect us in real estate. Became the state president. I followed him. We were the only board of realtors in the state of Connecticut that had 5 members who were state presidents. And we hold that name to this day. Very, very smart man. Great contribution to this, to our zoning, and thought the world, obviously, of this gentleman here. They worked together well.
One thing I was going through, I didn't take a picture of it, but one letter I found was in the early deliberations, they were talking about ethics. And they were wrestling with this, so there is a book by Mary Louise King, who wrote The History of New Canaan. And she wrote the first 20 years of the New Canaan Board of Realtors, the New Canaan MLS. And she year by year, chronicle of the changes. And she said, we're really wrestling with, and I think this is probably in 1960s, the fact that people die and realtors immediately swoop in and say, do you want to sell the house? Do you want to sell the house? And they said, we don't think that that's ethical. So we've decided that the board of realtors will have one of our lawyer contact them instead and say, do you want to sell your house? And I thought, and a lawyer from the ethics committee of the board of realtors. And I thought, what a great idea. When you want to just say, well, of course he's ethical. He's on the ethics committee. What could be more ethical than that? And I thought, wow, times sure have changed. Skip, you want to tell us about trying to compile the stats in the days before we had internet? And I even brought, I think, every agency knows how important it is to put out tables and graphs, and it's how every agency, and this, by the way, gets produced in New York and shipped out here. And they make one of these for Palm Beach, New Canaan, Greenwich, and then they send them out here. But in the old days, we relied on Skip for that.
Spreadsheets.
Spreadsheets. Rick Kellum. And did you have to call Rick and say how many? And I mean, how did Rick get the information to get it to you? Did you have to call around?
Well, no, he was a pioneer in
Yes.
putting that stuff together. He was. I followed him.
So Rick started it, and then you picked up and became known for the market report. To get to know that there were 53, and I'll go back to that slide, 53 sales that year in 1993. Did you call the 6 offices, or was that getting published somewhere?
We would go to town hall, the town clerk's office, and see the closings.
So you go down to town hall.
That was the awesome amount.
Talk to me about the book. Before we had the internet, we had a binder, and so I don't know. Maybe Carolyn, you want to talk about the binder?
No, I hate that binder.
You hate the binder.
Because I have to keep up with it all the time. It's really a problem.
Talk to me about the binder you hate, Carolyn. What was the binder?
A big black binder where you have to go in every day and update the.
You'd open up the
You have to
rings,
open up the rings and.
pull out the ones that sold,
Yeah. And
rip them up.
Put in the new ones.
Yeah, and then mark down the things that were maybe under contract, and then eventually, so I had to have somebody hired to come in and do that little bit of work, because I couldn't take it.
It was confidential. Only if you were a realtor could you get the new sheets. And you would subscribe, and they would show up in your mailbox each week, and you'd put your sheets in the binder and take out the old sheets of what had sold, and then you'd mark them up, and then you'd hold on to that book, because the only way somebody coming into town could find out what's for sale is to knock on the door of a real estate office, and then you'd come out with your secret binder and say, right? So you want to talk about who wants to talk to me about the binders? Because the binders were a major part of the business, and it was how an agent had value, because you had the secret stuff. Now it's on the internet and everybody knows what everybody else knows, but owning the binder, and the only way you got the binder was being a member of the New Canaan Board of Realtors and the New Canaan MLS.
But you had to go to the New Canaan Board of Realtors office in your little mailbox and get all of that information. That, you physically went there.
Yeah, you have to go again.
That, again, I'm sorry, I don't mean to talk so much.
No, that's why you're here.
There was, I hesitate to say camaraderie, but there was more of that. We saw one another. You knew who was sick, who needed help, who had issues that they needed support. It was like a great big family. And now we help one another, but the communication just isn't there. We were there every day, we were getting all the mail, and if you were not a member, you didn't have access to that information.
Yeah, one of the most humiliating things in life was to be somebody looking for a house, and you'd go into the realtor's office, and you'd say, this is our budget, and they'd open the book, and there'd be one page.
What year was this? When did you come to town?
1980. Yeah.
1980?
Yeah. You know, you're moving out of the apartment, you're coming up to a house, and you've already stretched everything as high as you can stretch it, and then some.
Why did you come to New Canaan in 1980?
Well, we were a newly formed family of divorcees with children. We needed space. I was living in Pound Ridge. My future wife was living in Norwalk.
And this was the midway point.
Meet you halfway.
No, I had become familiar with New Canaan because in Pound Ridge, there's sort of this great divide. Some people go to the Westchester side of Pound Ridge and shop and do all that. And some come to the Connecticut side, and I had always been coming to the Connecticut. I liked it. It looked nice, and if you could afford it, and we got lucky.
How much did you spend? Because I'm going to ask Susan, who also came in 1980, the same question. How much did you spend in 1980?
For our house?
Yeah.
$400,000.
$400,000. Wow.
Couldn't find you a chicken coop for that.
Susan, how much did you spend for 5 Marshall Ridge Road, corner of Marshall Ridge Road and Richmond Hill in 1980?
I think it was 129,000.
I think it was $250. I think it was $250.
Okay, well, see.
$250,000 for an 1860s antique on a quarter acre for $250, and interest rates were what?
17%.
Yeah.
So when they come complaining to me now about, oh, we're not gonna, the rates are just, it's ridiculous, the rates are up to like 7.5%. 17%, we didn't even question it, whatever the cost was, but I mean, when I look back at how they've come down, to hear anybody complain about interest rates, just, it's a non-starter. I mean, I just can't even believe it. That's like the major thing that they think about is the rates. But why New Canaan? Well, my parents, they did this careful research of all the places where they should.
T&Z.
And so once I was in New Canaan, by then I was already married, and by the time they moved, I was living in New York with my husband. And when it came time to come back out, I thought, well, by now I know New Canaan pretty well. And for a lot of reasons, it was the place to go.
And even though you knew New Canaan well, and you had the book, the secret book, they didn't let you just start selling real estate in this town on day one. You went to work for Mabel Lamb, and she said, you will follow me for a year before I'll let you go take an appointment.
Before I went to Mabel Lamb, I said, I finally decided that I'm going to work in New Canaan instead of New York. And in New York, I had an interior design business. So I said, this is a natural. I'll be a realtor because I know so much about houses, like that would matter. And what I did is, I made a list, I think there were 16 real estate offices in New Canaan at the time. I mean, it was just like more than a dozen. And I made a list, and I went and interviewed at every single one. And the last one I wanted to go to was Maple Lamb. Oh no, Brotherhood and Higley or Maple Lamb. I knew about Maple Lamb because out across from the street from my church, there was a wooden sign with a lamb this big that just flopped in the breeze. So I remembered this lamb, and I said, what is this? And that's a real estate office. But, so I went and I interviewed at every single office, and there was more than a dozen, to find out, because I'm never gonna have a chance again to get into one of those offices and find out how they think and how they sell and how they do. So I went to every one of them. It was great. And then in the end, it was Maple Lamb or Brother. So I go to Brotherhood and Higley, and they say, "Oh, we don't take any newbies. You got only experienced agents in this office." So then I go over to Maple Lamb, and not that she was easier, but she had 9 agents in that office, and she looked at me like, why would I take and train somebody? But she said, I'm in this New York City navy blue suit, because that's what you wear in New York when you go to work. Nobody wears jeans. And I walk in with my suit and my briefcase, and she said, I like that's the look I want. So I'll take you. But you can't sell any real estate. You gotta follow, you can find somebody in this office to take you by the hand and follow. You carry Nina Brown. You ask Nina if you can carry her bags. And after a year, then we'll see if I can let you represent us. So I followed her around, I carried her bags, and I went to every listing opportunity and everything. It was like full-time, 22-hour-a-day job following Nina Brown around and learning the business. And finally, I was allowed to get my license and be one of the gang.
And I thought I sold you your first house, but I guess I didn't. Second.
Okay, Rob.
You probably did.
Just
I'm sure you did.
had a great discussion, these all were really fascinating. So in our case, Deloitte, where I was a partner, moved me from Johannesburg to New York in 1988. Where did you come to New York?
89.
89, all at the same time. And one of the partners in New York with whom I worked lived in Greenwich, and his wife was a broker with actually a Coldwell Banker. And she showed us around Greenwich, and she also had a Stamford license, so she showed us around Stamford. And we said, what about Darien, what about Westport, what about New Canaan? And she says, I have people I work with in all those towns. And she gave us someone in Darien and someone in Westport. But she says, when you mention New Canaan, when you go there, that's why you're going to live. That's where you're going to live. So I said, well, why is that? And she said, you haven't met Barbara Cleary yet. You're going to live.
That is now illegal to tell you where you're going to live. just going to put that out there. Any parting words from any of you? I know Chris doesn't want to dominate it, but that's why you're here. You know.
Well, in 1977, I got a house for $86,000 on Hampton Lane next to Bailey Stewart. Bought it from one of the Bowtons, and they said, go see Pete Raymond at Buchanan Savings Bank, and you'll get a mortgage on a handshake, and that's exactly what happened.
John, I was going to ask you, when they changed from pocket cards to binders, is that when the women got a lead in real estate because they had bigger purses to carry the binders?
You could not fit this in a purse. It was a serious. And there is an agent now, I think, Mary Higgins, who still maintains like her. You know, she has her binders. So when a house comes on the market now, she says, no, John, they're still valuable. I pull out my old binder and I look at the past history on these and what was said and my notes on these houses. When I drive around with Susan, and I have to say, when a new agent comes in my office and I say, oh, just drive around with Susan for a little while. And they're like, what do you mean? You'll see. And you drive around with Chris Hussey or Susan or Skip, And they'll be like, oh, I remember when this house sold, and it was for $200,000, and it needed so much work. And then they added and that house, and I remember when that house sold, that was a really great house. Oh, the gardens back there, exquisite. And it's a tour of New Canaan. If you've been in every house in town. Have you been in every house in town? Probably every house built before 1980. You've probably been in every one of them. And it's amazing to drive around with a realtor with that kind of encyclopedic knowledge of the houses.
You know what really, I'm thinking, looking back, having grown up here, to see the changes in town since we were little, since we went to center school, which is now a parking lot, since we were the last class to graduate from what is now the police department. That was our high school, Joe Gucci.
Yeah.
Well, graduated from there. See all the changes.
So I guess what I've learned is that it was, first I learned from Chris that it was a people business, first and foremost. I learned from Laszlo that even though you think particular zoning, Susan's words, means we start with no, he said no. We didn't start with no. Particular zoning doesn't mean restrictive zoning. It means working with somebody and compromise in order to get the best result for the neighborhood, right?
Right, and we didn't let you say, I have a piece of land with a brilliant idea, until we sit down and say, is that brilliant idea really brilliant for the community or just for you? And then you had to compromise and say, well, wait a minute, I have to think of the community as well.
That's how we did it. I did over 50 subdivisions with Laszlo with that kind of basis. Over 50 properties. I've got them in the files in the office. But we subdivided all those properties, and we actually, luckily, never got into trouble with neighbors or anything else. It worked. It really did.
It's the only town in this area that has this zoning where you have, I get out the map and I say, so here's the middle of town right here. And this is how it goes. You get the half-acre zoning, you get the 1 acre zoning, you get the 2 acre zoning, and then this is the 4 acre zoning. Oh, wow, that makes sense. So when you go and buy a house in that zone, you see similar sized properties, and it keeps the value up of each individual property. But if you, in the other towns, like Sanford is a perfect example, which we were trying to, which is we're the opposite of. You go up and you find your perfect house, but it's surrounded by a mix. You know, a 2-family house here, an apartment building there, and a farm over here, and you have to say, which one am I? I mean, it's just not, eventually it evolves, and you gotta stick with what you started with. You can't rezone after. And this was from the beginning done, and I love that little, and people, when they come looking from town to town, they think it's all the same. $100 million house here, and then $1 million house there. No. Our zoning, this is how it goes. So this is what the kind of background to it, and it makes sense. It's a good investment.
John, before we all depart.
Carolyn will get the last word.
No, I'm sorry. One thing we should, if you don't know, let me tell you that this gentleman really is Mr. Zoning. We talk about our homes, from the modest to the multi-million, but this is a man who cared for people who were in the town and maybe couldn't afford to live here anymore. And how could we help these people? And back in what? I think I started in 1978.
Is that it?
No, seriously, in 1978 we began what is now Canaan Parish. And this man had a tremendous amount to do with it, and I would like us to acknowledge him.
Yes.